Hi everybody, I wanted to take some time today to talk to you about some new international guidance that has been produced for adults with severe and profound hearing loss. My name's Laura Turton and I both edited and co-authored this paper that's now available. Now, the reason that this paper came about was because PHONAC approached a group of international experts to pull together this best practice guidance, and they sponsored this project. As part of that sponsorship, this is an open access document, so when we talk about the guidance and the reference towards the end of this presentation, please feel free to go and download it for free so that you are able to look at all of the different recommendations. So routine guidance just doesn't quite cover all aspects of the needs for severe to profound hearing loss, and that's why we designed this. And there are several challenges that we have with this group. So just as with any group, we need to look past that condition of severe to profound hearing loss, and we need to be providing person-centred care. We need to really understand the limitations of the amplification that a hearing aid is going to give them, so that we can both optimise that hearing aid amplification, but also that we can counsel around those limitations. We need to be comfortable with assistive listening devices. In particular, we need to really understand remote microphones because they can be game changers for people. We need to make sure that we're comfortable talking about the benefits of cochlear implantation so that it's seen as a continuum of amplification from hearing aids to cochlear implantation for those patients who wish to pursue that later on. And that doesn't matter whether we work in a centre where there are cochlear implants or whether we refer into a centre. We need to have those good links and good communication lines. We need to be comfortable with communication strategies so that we can counsel people around the impact of severe and profound hearing loss and have an understanding of those psychosocial impacts. We need to have strategies for both hearing loss and tinnitus for any patient who says that tinnitus is causing them problems and that they need that managing in more detail. And just as with people with mild to moderate hearing loss, we need to be measuring outcomes. But what you'll see in the guidance is that we recognise the limitations of the outcomes that we currently have when we're trying to measure for this group. So who are the people that we see with severe and profound hearing loss? Who are these patients? First of all, they're adults. They may have been referred over through the transition clinic of the from paediatrics, or they may have come directly with an acquired hearing loss in adulthood. But they're often long-term, full-time users of amplification who are highly reliant on their devices and are therefore experts around how they like their devices and their hearing loss themselves. And their amplification needs are unique because we are trying to effectively squish a wide range of input levels, making sure that they're audible and comfortable and safe within this narrow range of residual hearing towards the bottom of the audiogram. Assistive technologies and hearing dogs might be of relevance to them. They certainly might benefit from wireless microphone technology. They may be cochlear implant candidates or bimodal candidates, and they pose unique hearing and tinnitus and psychosocial and communication rehabilitation challenges. And so these are often the most exciting patients to see. They are the ones who are going to push our knowledge in terms of the technology that we're fitting and recommending, and they're also going to push our counselling and our adjustment strategies to the absolute limits, and therefore, although challenging, are probably one of the most rewarding client groups that we have. And I think the key thing to remember with everybody that we see in that person-centred care that we're trying to deliver is that everybody has a slightly different deaf identity, and as part of this understanding that we're having with them, we need to work out with them where their deaf identity sits. Are they considering themselves culturally big D deaf? and therefore we need to manage them differently for if they consider themselves hard of hearing in adulthood, predominantly with hearing peers. So interestingly, the World Health Organization has re-graded the severity of hearing loss, and so this has even more impact in terms of the guidelines than before, because severe hearing loss, rather than being at 71 decibels bilaterally as per the BSA recommendations, is considered to be 61 decibels. So suddenly you're likely to see many more patients with severe or profound hearing loss because the boundaries have moved slightly. Because this was an international piece of guidance, we have stuck with World Health Organization, even though in the UK we are much more used to considering the BSA guidance. So the prevalence of severe and profound hearing loss, why should we be concerned about these patients at all? Well, 87 million people are predicted worldwide to have severe and profound hearing loss, which works out to the equivalent of 0.7% of the general population, which in the UK is 500 million people. So that's an awful lot of our patients, or 6.7% of the clinical population. Interestingly as well, the median age for this group is 79 years, so we're much more likely to have additional long-term conditions and a greater burden of disease. And it works out approximately that 2 out of 10 adults with hearing loss are estimated to have a severe and profound hearing loss with the WHO guidance. There are huge consequences to having severe to profound hearing loss. It will impact on patients' communication skills, it increases their anxiety and their likelihood of depression. It certainly increases frustration around communication, and because of that, they're much more likely to withdraw and isolate. There is a rise in dependency on others, because in a very oral world, if you are struggling to hear, you will quite often ask somebody else to do something for you. There is an increased association with dementia, a greater risk of falls, an increased likelihood of unemployment, of early death, and overall, considering all of those things, it reduces the quality of life. So what were the aims of this project? Well, we wanted to be able to look at the evidence and consider that these patients needed additional considerations for their assessment, for their treatment, and for their follow-up care when compared to their better hearing peers. We wanted to look at the fact that they had no best practice guidance specifically to them at the moment, and that they needed to rely on much more than just hearing aids, and therefore they differed from other populations. The WHO categorisation meant that we recognised that more audiologists around the globe were going to be seeing these patients, but that sometimes it was reported by professionals that there was a fear factor, that we don't see that many of them in comparison to mild to moderate hearing loss, and because of that I'm concerned that I'm not able to give them the right care. That outside of hearing aids, there is so much more that needs to be considered with this group in comparison to their better hearing peers. And in particular, and certainly in the UK, where the BCIG and BAA Cochlear Implant Champions project is going on, we needed to make sure that we're incorporating cochlear implant conversations much more readily. So what does the guidance cover? In essence, an awful lot. It goes through the whole pathway from assessment to long-term care, and it looks at all of these different areas. So we go from assessment to selecting technology and focusing on things around hearing aid technology, to selecting technology around prescribing and fitting remote microphones, to making referrals for cochlear implants, to looking at rehabilitation and the psychosocial communication and rehabilitation that's required, looking at tinnitus in more detail, and then looking at measuring outcomes and having that long-term care. And in total, there are 153 recommendations based on current evidence and advice. So we know that internationally that there are all these general guidance that are out there, and we purposely made sure that we didn't repeat any of that. So when you go through those 153 recommendations, they should all be in addition to what you're providing on a routine care pathway. So for example, in assessment, we don't go into details about otoscopy and things like that. The recommendations themselves were made to start off with by reviewing a number of different databases, and these were the ones that we looked at. And those databases were reviewed in terms of the scientific journals and what was peer reviewed. Where we couldn't then find recommendations that were peer reviewed, we looked at non-peer reviewed articles such as the Hearing Review. And then when things were ambiguous or conflicting, and actually there was quite a large amount of time where that was the case, we came together as a group of authors so that we could look at developing this as a consensus. For each of the 153 recommendations, there is a table in the appendix that shows you where that recommendation came from. And the first part of the table shows you the recommendation itself. The second column shows you the evidence taken from hopefully a peer-reviewed journal. The third column covers what that reference is so that you're able to go away and look at the reference in more detail if you want to. Then we took the level of evidence for each one. So we looked at our pyramid of evidence with the systematic reviews and meta-analysis of randomised controlled trials being at the top and labelled at a level 1, all the way down to where, as experts, we had to come together and make a decision about the recommendation being at the bottom of the pyramid and a number 6. So as you go through, it allows you to see the quality of evidence that's there. We then looked at the grade of recommendation. So how many studies were available that were consistently at levels 1 or 2 gave you a much higher grade of recommendation than if it was based on level 6 of expert opinion. So again, you can see the quality of evidence and also the quality that we had to make recommendations on. We then looked at the type of evidence in terms of where it was measured. So if it was labelled in terms of efficacy or EF, then it was measured under laboratory or ideal conditions. If it was measured as effectiveness or EV, then it's measured in the real world. And again, just for further information for you all as readers. And finally, where we had to go elsewhere, so where it wasn't specifically severe or profound hearing loss, we have labelled that evidence up so that you can see that. MM stands for when we've had to get the evidence for mild to moderate hearing loss, P was for paediatrics, and CI was for cochlear implantation. So what does that all look like? And this is an example. So we would take the first recommendation within audiological assessment of severe and profound hearing loss and looking at diagnostic information. We would look at the evidence, where that source of or reference came from, the level, the grade, whether it was EF or EV, and whether we had to get it from elsewhere. And that's listed all the way through, so we've been as transparent as we can with every single recommendation. So So to make this not only guidance and recommendations, but also a really usable document, we have provided toolkit support at each stage of the recommendations. So underneath each recommendation, if there are tools that we were aware of, we have included those with references for you to be able to go away and find and then use those in your clinics. One of the really clear things that we talk about from introduction to summary and conclusion is the lack of evidence in this group. It's amazing to me how substantially less research there has been on severe and profound hearing loss than there have been for mild to moderate hearing losses. That really, outside of cochlear implantation, there is so very little that's available to us. So despite decades of hearing research, severe and profound hearing loss is strikingly absent in the literature. And we hope that this guidance will use everything that's available to us now, but what we would really like to see is in 5 years' time, when it needs reviewing, is that way more of the gaps have been filled. So if you are considering doing research, if you are a researcher, please consider this group. So the guidelines have been published by Seminars in Hearing. As mentioned at the beginning, it was PHONAC who have sponsored this project, and they are open access. So please feel free to go and download them and look at them. What we would really like from this is that people go away and audit their own clinical practice and their department's clinical practice against these guidelines, so that best practice can be put in where there's gaps in your service. And we also recognise that from these guidelines that not only is there gaps in research, but also there may be a need for change in audiological training based around these, both in terms of new audiologists being educated at universities plus CPD opportunities. So I hope this taster webinar gives you a little bit of CPD opportunity if you're an existing audiologist. So I'd just like to thank all of our expert authors who came together and worked really hard on these guidelines, and I'd like to thank PHONAC for giving us the opportunity to be able to produce them in the first place. Thank you for listening to me. If you would like to be in contact with me, please feel free to contact me through any of these means. I think this is the time that we need to start conversations about patients with severe and profound hearing loss, and I hope these guidelines allow us to do that. Thank you.